This is the NeXT Cube. Okay, as much as I'd love to own such an iconic machine, they're incredibly hard to come by. But I managed the almost impossible. I acquired a NeXTstation color for my collection quite a while ago. So today we'll continue our exploration on Apple's Unix origins, where we've already covered AUX and Rhapsody in previous episodes.
Rhapsody, as you may know, was Apple's prelude and foundation to OS X, or macOS as it's called today. At its core, Rhapsody was essentially an evolved version of NeXT operating system OpenStep, internally treated as version 5, which came into Apple's hands after the acquisition of NeXT in 1996. No one could have guessed that 11 years prior, in 1985, when Steve Jobs founded NeXT after being forced out of Apple in a power struggle with CEO John Sculley. Jobs later said that his years at NeXT were the most creative and productive in his life, ultimately leading to the release of the famous NeXT Cube in 1988, featuring an operating system 5 years ahead of its time.
So where would you put NeXT? Right here. For two reasons. One, we think we're about 3 years ahead of anyone else in understanding some things necessary to do that. And two, it's the only place left. There's very good companies doing the other three. So if we don't survive there, we don't have a reason for being here.
NeXT would not only lay the foundation for Apple's future operating systems, but also fueled some major inventions of modern computing. Sir Tim Berners-Lee developed the concept for the World Wide Web in 1989 on a NeXT workstation. And if that weren't enough, NeXT machines also played a role in gaming history, as its software developed Doom on NeXT hardware. Obsolete computer technology is my passion. I'm the Vintage Collector, and these are my stories. Steve Jobs founded NeXT in 1985 after he was ousted from his own company. In a unique twist of events, Jobs' entire Macintosh division was handed over to Jean-Louis Gasset, a name that would resurface prominently a decade later when Apple went looking for a new operating system in the mid-90s. Gasset, now running BE Inc., pitched BOS as Apple's next generation OS. But as we know, Apple ultimately ditched BE and instead chose to buy NeXT for $427 million. That decision is especially interesting when you consider that the very same company, Apple, had filed a lawsuit against Jobs back in 1985. Apple accused him of poaching employees and misusing insider knowledge right after his departure. The dispute was eventually settled out of court, but with some strict conditions. Jobs agreed not to hire any additional Apple employees for 6 months, to give Apple limited visibility into NeXT's product plans, and to refrain from releasing any new computer hardware before 1987.
Next, the board goes to the first of two pick-and-place robots. This one places the smallest transistors, capacitors, and integrated circuits on the board from locational dimensions programmed at NeXT. Those silver solder pads you're looking at are about 1/100th of an inch high.
Before we jump into the hardware, a huge thank you to PCBWay for supporting this episode. If you love bringing retro ideas to life, custom adapters, replacement boards, brackets, whatever you can dream up, PCBWay has you covered. They offer PCB production and assembly, 3D printing, CNC machining, pretty much the full toolbox for makers. And right now, their 8th project design contest is live. It's open worldwide and you can enter anything from tiny gadgets to full-blown engineering projects. If you've been tinkering on something cool, this is the perfect time to show it off. Check the link below and join in. The NeXTstation, released in 1990 with its pizza box design, was a fundamental departure from the NeXT Cube, which, by the way, was formerly just called the NeXT Computer when it debuted in 1988. The cube represented NeXT's original high-end approach. It shipped at roughly $10,000 once configured with a hard disk and display. Inside was a 25 MHz Motorola 68030 processor, a dedicated 16-bit digital signal processor, and the 17-inch megapixel display running at an unusual 1120 by 832 pixels resolution.
But before we go, there's one last thing about the NeXT hardware that I wanted to brief you on, and you'll be able to see a little bit later on today. We haven't talked about mass storage.
One of its more controversial choices was the use of a 256 MB magneto-optical disk as the primary storage medium.
The NeXT computer is the first computer in the world to ship with read-write erasable optical technology storage.
It was technologically interesting, but in practice it had a few drawbacks, like slow seek times and noticeably higher latency compared to a conventional hard drive. For a modern workstation, the MO drive became a bottleneck rather than a highlight. The NeXTstation shifted towards a more accessible design and price point. At $4,995 it was roughly half the cost of a cube. Hardware moved to a 25 MHz 68040, 8 MB of RAM by default, and a conventional 105 or 250 MB SCSI hard disk, along with a 2.88 MB super floppy drive.
We have one board that is the whole computer, as we just saw. We have slots for 3 additional boards.
The slab dropped the cube's internal expansion slots and built-in optical drive, but the trade-off resulted in a simpler, more desk-friendly system. The NeXTstation Color, shown here, expanded on the same platform. Priced at $7,995, it used the same 68040 CPU but shipped with 12 MB of RAM to support graphic workloads. It provided 12-bit color output at the familiar 1120 by 832 resolution. NeXT later introduced 33 MHz turbo versions before ultimately leaving the hardware business in 1993 and shifting their focus entirely to software development. From that point on, NeXTSTEP became the company's primary product. Canon, who had already invested $100 million into NeXT, continued to support the platform on their own terms. As part of that investment, Canon had committed to using NeXTSTEP on its workstations, introducing their own Intel-based systems under the Object.station brand. These machines were built around Intel processors like the DX4 and were designed specifically to run NeXTSTEP for Intel rather than NeXT's original 68K hardware. Meanwhile, NeXT continued to develop and offer its NeXTSTEP operating system, later rebranded as OpenSTEP, to other hardware vendors, extending the platform beyond Motorola 68K to Intel, HP, PA RISC and Sun SPARC architectures. But before we can dive into NeXTSTEP, let's look at this machine here. Although the megapixel display, and yes, this massive 21-inch CRT really does weigh a ton, uses a standard 13W3 connector, you can't plug it in directly into the NeXTstation. You need the sound box in between. On the original NeXT systems, the display handled more than just video. The keyboard connected to the monitor, the mouse to the keyboard, and a small logic board inside the display processed all I/O signals back to the computer. When NeXT introduced their color machines, they moved that logic out of the display and into an external unit, said Soundbox. From then on, video ran straight from the slab to the monitor via 13W3, while the Soundbox took care of everything else: audio input and output, the microphone, the speaker, and all keyboard and mouse communication via special DB19Y cable. And while the monitor has its own dedicated power button, I was a bit surprised to hear a fan spinning up inside it. Even more unusual is the complete absence of a power button on the NeXTstation itself. Instead, it lives right here on the keyboard. At least everything seems to come alive. The CRT fires up and the NeXTstation follows. This unit appears to have 16 MB of RAM installed, but it just sits there waiting for the SCSI hard drive. Endlessly. Not really a surprise, the previous owner already warned me the drive was dead. So I guess the next step is obvious, time to open up the slab. Although it might look like a plain plastic housing from the outside, the NeXTstation actually has a magnesium enclosure on the inside. It looks generally intact, although I'm not entirely sure whether these discolorations are early signs of corrosion. And I don't know about you, but the moment I learned this case was made of magnesium, my mind immediately went back to burning magnesium strips in chemistry class. For the record, magnesium ignites at around 473 degrees Celsius, so it's not exactly a fire hazard unless you deliberately try to set it on fire. As mentioned, there's 16 MB of RAM installed, and I'll definitely upgrade that to 32 MB. As for the battery, I'm not entirely sure why this one has soldering tabs, but since it's reading under 3 volts, I'll just replace it. And by the way, if your slab refuses to power on, the most common reason is simply a missing or dead battery. Yes, really, the NeXTstation won't start at all without a working battery. The SCSI hard drive is nothing special, it is pretty much the same model you would find in many machines of the era, including classic Macintoshes. Truth be told, I'm not sure whether this is the original drive or if it was swapped at some point. But it does not matter, since I will be replacing it right away. But before I could even get that far, I had to deal with the RAM monitor. After replacing the NVRAM battery, all settings were restored to factory defaults, so the NeXTstation completed its self-test and then simply sat there, waiting to boot from the network. To get into the RAM monitor, you press the right-hand command key together with the tilde key. There is a basic help menu built in, but you will find much more complete documentation online. In my case, all I needed to do was to press P to enter the preferences and then set the boot device to SD, which tells the system to boot from the SCSI disk. To install NeXTSTEP, you'll need a SCSI CD-ROM drive. The distribution is readily available online, for example on the Macintosh repository. Just keep in mind the ISO file alone won't suffice, you'll need the boot floppy disk. Now, there's many floppy images available on the Macintosh repository, but actually those are for the Intel platform. You won't be needing those except for the Moto boot disk, which is a shorthand to Motorola. You can simply transfer the disk image to a floppy using the dd command. For the ISO, you should write it to a coaster using disk at once mode. I used the CD record command line tool for that purpose. With the floppy and CD-ROM inserted, simply type in BFD at the RAM monitor prompt to have the NeXTstation boot from the floppy disk. It'll drop you right away into the installer where you can select the installer language. It'll ask you as well for the hard drive to use should there be multiple available. And that's it, off we go. There's not much progress indication than just a list of files flying by as they are copied. NeXTSTEP is much simpler to install than, let's say, SGI IRIX, whose setup procedure I always considered as overly complicated. Eventually, NeXTSTEP asks you to reboot, which brings you into the second part of the graphical installer. You will notice this spinning beach ball as it was called in later years. Officially, it is the spinning weight cursor and it still exists in macOS today. Its origin goes all the way back to the original NeX computer with the magneto-optical disc, because the icon resembles the rainbow-colored reflection on a spinning ammo platter. And if you have ever worked with the APIs of macOS or with related systems like iOS and wondered why so many class names begin with NS, that prefix also comes directly from the NeXTSTEP and OpenSTEP APIs. Yes, modern macOS builds on foundations that were established with NeXTSTEP almost 40 years ago. At this stage, something odd happened, which I at first appointed to the SCSI hard drive. Because it simply died and stopped to spin, the graphical installer, subject to install extra components and language packs, just locked up. But as we would see later on, there was more to it. Back in the ROM monitor, the system naturally complained about not finding any SCSI disks. Too bad, because I had completely run out of old SCSI hard drives. But I had a ZuluSCSI on hand, so I updated the firmware to the latest release, created a disk image on the SD card and installed NeXTSTEP again. And then it happened again. The graphical installer simply locked up exactly as before. The strange part was that the ZuluSCSI itself appeared to be working correctly. In later reinstall attempts, sometimes it stalled at the exact same point, and other times it continued without any issues. On top of that, the NeXTstation intermittently complained about not finding any SCSI devices at all, even though I had double checked the configuration and determination settings. At the same time, I was also working on my Mac SE30, which had just suffered a SCSI drive failure as well. I tried the SCSI2SD in that machine, but I was not happy with it either. So I swapped them around. In the end, the SE30 seemed much happier with the ZuluSCSI, and the NeXTstation seemed to cope better with the SCSI2SD. It is important to stress that ZuluSCSI, BlueSCSI and SCSI2SD are quite similar in functionality and configuration. In most cases, you should set any of these SCSI emulators to SCSI ID 1 because that is the default ID used for the factory installed hard drive. Of course, any other ID will also work except ID 7 since that is always the SCSI controller itself. One common pitfall is that the ROM monitor's ID of the drive IDs is not necessarily the same as the SCSI bus IDs. That can get confusing if you're not familiar with NeXT hardware. In my case, using the SCSI2SD utility, I configured the first emulated hard drive on SCSI ID 1. NeXTSTEP doesn't support partitions larger than 2 GB, so for both real drives and emulated ones, you should stay below that size. For the SCSI emulation, it is important to use 512-byte sectors along with 139 sectors per track and 4 heads per cylinder. These are the recommended values, and while the drive name itself is mostly cosmetic, these geometry settings matter for a reliable installation. And so I found myself installing NeXTSTEP once more, only to watch it stall again during the graphical installer. Then, on the next attempt, it passed without any issues. At this point, I started to suspect some kind of timing problem. I never fully figured it out, but eventually I reached the NeXTSTEP desktop. Since I reached that point already several weeks ago, I can say with confidence that I have not seen any more random SCSI detection errors in the ROM monitor since switching everything over to the SCSI2SD adapter. At this stage, I also added a small mounting bracket I found on Thingiverse. It allows me to fit an LED behind one of the small ventilation holes so the hard drive activity becomes visible from the outside. The NeXTstation does not have any external activity LEDs by default, so this is a small but useful and completely reversible modification.
Before we wrap up, a quick thank you to the people who make these videos possible. My channel members, to everyone in the vintage supporters and vintage enthusiast tiers. Your help really keeps this channel going, especially with projects like this NeXTstation restoration. Thank you so much for your ongoing support. And if you want to join the community and support the channel as well, you will find the information right below this video. So, having NeXTSTEP finally on the desktop brings us to the end of part 1. But there's more to explore. I'm the Vintage Collector, and this was my story for today. Thanks for watching, and be sure to catch up for part 2 next Sunday.
Next time on the Vintage Collector. Now that the NeXTstation is alive, we dive into NeXTSTEP itself. We take a closer look at the Workspace Manager and discover familiarities that still exist in macOS today. We go hunting for contemporary software, including Office applications for NeXTSTEP, early web browsers, and of course the iconic Doom. But things do get strange. Some programs crash instantly, anything that relies on X11 will not run on the default system, and NeXTSTEP simply refuses to believe it is the year 2025 unless you install a patch.